The sun had just begun to rise over the rolling hills of Green Valley, casting a golden hue over the sprawling farmland that had been my home for the past decade. I stood on the porch of my farmhouse, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, and took in the serene beauty of the morning. The air was crisp, the kind of crisp that makes you feel alive, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Duke, my loyal German shepherd, sat at my feet, his ears perked up as he surveyed the land he considered his kingdom. It was a perfect morning, until it wasn't. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to Duke. It was the sound of a generator, followed by the high-pitched whine of a power saw. My grip tightened around the mug as I frowned. I didn't have many rules on my farm, but one of them was clear: no loud noises before 9 a.m. Unless it was me making them. What the hell? I muttered under my breath, setting the mug down on the porch railing. Duke let out a low growl, his hackles rising as he sensed my irritation. I grabbed my boots and slipped them on, then made my way down the dirt path that led to the source of the noise. By the time I reached the top of the hill, I saw them, 3 men in neon vests, swarming around my bridge like termites on a fresh log. One of them, a wiry man with a clipboard in hand, was barking orders like he was some kind of self-appointed general. The other 2 were busy dismantling the planks of my bridge, the very bridge that was the only way on and off my property. My blood boiled. "Hey," I shouted, waving my arm as I approached. "What the hell do you think you're doing to my bridge?" The man with the clipboard looked up, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Good morning, sir," he called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "We're here on behalf of the HOA, just addressing a safety concern." I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to process what I had just heard. "On my land," I said, my voice rising. "I've lived here for 10 years, and the nearest HOA is a good 5 miles away. The only safety concern around here is whether or not I'll twist my ankle laughing at your audacity." The man's grin didn't falter. "This structure doesn't meet community standards," he said, flipping through his clipboard. "It's a liability." "A liability?" I repeated, my voice steady but loud enough to make the 2 workers pause. "That's rich coming from the guy standing on my private property with a power saw. Listen, this is private land. You've got no business here, so pack up your tools and leave before I call the sheriff." The man gave me a pitying look, as if I were some clueless child who didn't understand the big, important world of HOA bureaucracy. "Sir," he said, his tone patronizing, "the HOA has authority over this entire area. We're just doing our job." I could feel my left eye twitching. Authority over this area? I gestured to the wide-open fields, the creek, and the barn in the distance. "Buddy, you're about 5 miles off the HOA's map. So unless you've got a magic wand that rewrites property lines, you're trespassing." That's when one of the workers, a burly man with arms like tree trunks, decided to chime in. "Look, man, we're just following orders. If you want to fight it, take it up with the HOA board." "Oh, don't worry," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'll take it up with them. But first, let me make something clear. If you don't stop what you're doing right now, you're going to have 2 problems. I pointed at the power saw still whining in his hands. 1, you're not going to have a saw anymore. And 2, I whistled sharply, and Duke came bounding down the hill, teeth bared and growling like he'd just found a raccoon in the henhouse. The 2 workers froze, their eyes darting between me and the dog. The clipboard man, to his credit, held his ground, but I could see the sweat forming on his brow. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his voice a little higher pitched now. "No," I said, smiling. "That's a promise. Now pack up and go before Duke decides he doesn't like trespassers." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the big guy with the saw muttered, "Screw this," and started packing up the tools. The clipboard man looked like he wanted to argue, but one sharp bark from Duke changed his mind. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind half-dismantled planks and a mess of splinters. As their truck disappeared down the road, I stood by the bridge, Duke at my side, surveying the damage. "Well, boy," I said, scratching his ears. "Looks like the HOA just made their first mistake." Duke wagged his tail, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. If they thought they were getting away with this, they were sorely mistaken. The morning after the bridge fiasco, I was still steaming. Every time I looked out the window and saw the gaping hole in my bridge, my blood pressure spiked. I'd been crossing that bridge for years. It had held up through storms, floods, and even one very questionable attempt to haul a tractor that was definitely too heavy for it. But apparently, it didn't pass the HOA's sacred community standards. I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. If the clipboard man and his crew thought they could just waltz onto my property, dismantle part of my bridge, and get away with it, they had another thing coming. After finishing my coffee, priorities obviously, I grabbed my truck keys, loaded Duke into the passenger seat, and headed into town. My first stop, the HOA office. If you've never had the misfortune of stepping into an HOA office, let me paint you a picture. Imagine a dentist's waiting room, but somehow more soul-sucking. Beige walls, motivational posters about community harmony, and a faint smell of stale coffee. The receptionist, a woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, glanced up as I walked in. "Can I help you?" she asked, not even trying to sound polite. "Yeah," I said, plastering on my best fake smile. "I'm here to see whoever's in charge of tearing down bridges that don't belong to them." She blinked, clearly not expecting sarcasm this early in the day. "You mean the HOA president?" "That's right," I said. "Let me guess. She's the one with a clipboard and a god complex." The receptionist looked uncomfortable but nodded. "You'll need an appointment." "Well, I'll be sure to send a calendar invite after I get my bridge back," I shot back. "But for now, I'll settle for just 5 minutes." Before she could argue, the door behind her opened, and out walked the woman of the hour herself, Marcy, or as I like to call her, the clipboard queen. She was exactly what I'd expected, mid-50s, immaculately dressed, and armed with a clipboard that was practically glowing with self-importance. Her smile was the kind of thing you'd see on a car salesperson. Fake, calculated, and ready to drain you of every last dollar. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Oh, absolutely," I said, stepping forward. "You can start by explaining why your little demolition crew tried to tear down my bridge yesterday." Her smile didn't falter, but I saw the briefest flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Ah, you must be Mr. Carter. We sent you a notice last month regarding the bridge." "No, you didn't," I said flatly. "What you sent me was a glossy brochure full of HOA propaganda and a vague mention of community improvements. I'm not in your HOA, and my property isn't within your jurisdiction. So why exactly do you think you can touch my bridge?" Marcy clasped her hands in front of her clipboard, radiating fake patience. "The HOA has a responsibility to maintain the safety and aesthetic standards of the community. Your bridge posed a liability." "It posed a liability to who?" I interrupted. "The cows? The squirrels? Newsflash, lady, nobody crosses that bridge but me. And even if it was a problem, you'd still have no right to come onto my land without permission." Her smile tightened. "The HOA has the authority to address community concerns, Mr. Carter. If you disagree with our actions, you're welcome to file a formal complaint." "Oh, I'll do more than that," I said, my voice low. "I'll see you in court before I let you and your clipboard mafia get away with this." For the first time, her smile slipped just a little. She wasn't used to people pushing back, and I could tell it was throwing her off. "Well," she said, recovering quickly, "if that's how you feel, then I suppose we'll let the legal system decide. But I should warn you, Mr. Carter, the HOA has a very thorough legal team." "Great," I said, turning to leave. "I hope they're thorough enough to explain why you're trespassing on private property and filing fraud claims with the county. Should make for an interesting case." As I walked out the door, I could feel Marcy's eyes boring into the back of my head. Back at home, I started digging. If Marcy wanted to play the legal game, I was more than happy to oblige. I pulled out every document I had: property deeds, tax records, county maps. Sure enough, my farm was miles outside the HOA's official boundaries. Even better, I found a letter from the county that explicitly denied the HOA's request to expand their jurisdiction into my area. They had tried to annex nearby properties a year ago, and the county had shut them down cold. Feeling pretty smug, I called up a buddy of mine who worked for the county records office. He owed me a favor after I helped him out with a truck repair last spring, and within an hour, I had copies of the HOA's rejection letter, their bylaws, and even some juicy meeting minutes where Marcy and her cronies discussed their plans to assert influence over nearby landowners. Oh, it was game on. But I wasn't just fighting for myself. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted by Marcy and her clipboard army. My neighbor Jim, who'd been retired longer than Marcy had probably been alive, mentioned that the HOA had fined him for having an unapproved chicken coop. Never mind that the coop had been there since the 1980s. Then there was Lisa, a single mom running a small organic farm down the road. She'd refused to pay some bogus access fee the HOA had slapped on her, and a week later, her irrigation pipes mysteriously got cut. By the time I talked to half a dozen neighbors, it was clear this wasn't just about my bridge. Marcy and her HOA were on a power trip, and they'd been steamrolling anyone who dared stand in their way. So we formed a plan. Lisa handled the media side. She had a friend at the local paper who was more than happy to hear about HOA corruption. Jim, who used to work in law enforcement, offered to help with gathering evidence. And me? Well, let's just say I was ready to play hardball. The day after Rick spilled the beans, Lisa's article hit the front page of the local paper. The headline, HOA Overreach, Residents Speak Out Against Unchecked Power. It was a masterful piece of small-town journalism. The piece included interviews with me, Lisa, Jim, and Greg, as well as photos of my half-dismantled bridge, Lisa's sabotaged irrigation pipes, and Jim's infamous, unauthorized chicken coop. The article also mentioned the HOA's shady attempts to expand their jurisdiction and hinted at potential financial mismanagement. By noon, the town was buzzing. At the feed store, the diner, and even the post office, people were talking about Marcy and her clipboard brigade. And the best part? Not a single person was on her side. That afternoon, just as I was getting ready to check on the cows, my phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line read, HOA Financial Records, Confidential. I frowned, opening the email. Inside was a single sentence. Thought you might find this useful. Attached were dozens of scanned documents, budgets, expense reports, and emails between Marcy and the other board members. As I scrolled through the files, it became painfully clear just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. There were payments for landscaping services that didn't exist, invoices for security upgrades that had never been installed, and even a line item for a team-building retreat that was suspiciously vague. And then there were the fines, thousands of dollars collected from properties outside the HOA's boundaries, all funneled into a mysterious special projects fund. I forwarded the email to Lisa, Jim, and Rick, then called Lisa. Do you see this? I asked. Oh, I see it, she said, her voice tight with anger. This is a smoking gun if I've ever seen one. The HOA's next monthly meeting was scheduled for that Saturday, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. We'd spent the week rallying support, and by the time the meeting rolled around, the community center was packed to capacity. Marcy, dressed in a crisp blazer and clutching her trusty clipboard, took her place at the front of the room. She smiled her usual fake smile and launched into a speech about community values and maintaining harmony. I let her talk for about 5 minutes before raising my hand. Mr. Carter, she said, her smile faltering just a little. Do you have a question? Oh, I've got more than a question, I said, standing up. I've got some concerns about how the HOA is operating, specifically, outside its jurisdiction. Her smile froze. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean this, I said, holding up a stack of documents. The HOA's rejection letter from the county, a map showing their actual boundaries, and a few choice excerpts from the financial records. This is proof that the HOA has been illegally fining property owners and using the money for, well, let's call them questionable purposes. The room erupted in murmurs. Marcy's face turned pale. That's absurd, she said, her voice shaking slightly. The HOA operates with full transparency. Oh, really? Lisa stood up, holding up a copy of the financial records. Because these payments for landscaping and security sure don't look transparent to me. And what about the fines you've been collecting from people who aren't even in the HOA? Care to explain that? Marcy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Then Rick stood up, holding a printout of one of Marcy's emails. This one's my favorite, he said. It's from Marcy, instructing us to find creative ways to encourage compliance from non-HOA members. Sound familiar, Marcy? The murmurs turned into shouts. People started demanding answers, questioning every decision the HOA had made under Marcy's leadership. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Marcy's reign was over. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president, and the county announced an official investigation into the HOA's finances. As for me, I walked out of that meeting with a smile on my face and a promise from the board to pay for my bridge repairs. Lisa and Jim got their fines refunded, Greg got to keep his fence, and the rest of the community finally got a taste of justice. There's a special kind of silence that falls over a town after something big happens. It's not the usual quiet of early mornings or late nights, it's the hush of people pausing, processing, and figuring out how to move forward. That was the mood in the days following the HOA's public humiliation. Marcy's name had become a punchline overnight. People were calling her Clipboard Queen at the diner, the hardware store, and just about anywhere else locals gathered to gossip. The story spread like wildfire, fueled by Lisa's article, the town hall debacle, and a few well-timed Facebook posts. And the phrase, "Don't Marcy me," became shorthand for overstepping your boundaries. But while the town had moved on to mocking Marcy, I still had unfinished business. A few days after the meeting, I was out by the creek, taking measurements for the bridge repairs, when Duke's growl alerted me to company. I looked up to see a familiar figure trudging down the hill. Rick, the former HOA treasurer. He looked a little worse for wear, his suit rumpled and his tie slightly askew. "Morning, Rick," I called, leaning on my tape measure. "What brings you out here?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I thought you'd want to know what's happening with the investigation." "Oh." I raised an eyebrow. "And what's the verdict?" Rick sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's bad. Real bad. Turns out Marcy wasn't just skimming from the fines, she was funneling money into her personal accounts. The county's found over $50,000 in misappropriated funds so far, and that's just the beginning." I let out a low whistle. "That explains all those special projects." Rick nodded. "The board's in full-blown damage control mode. They're offering refunds to everyone who was fined illegally, but, well, the HOA is basically broke now. Most of the board members have resigned, and the county's taking over until they can figure out what to do next." I didn't feel an ounce of pity. Good. Maybe they'll think twice before pulling stunts like this again. The HOA, or what was left of it, agreed to cover the cost of my bridge repairs, but I wasn't about to trust them with the job. Instead, I hired a local contractor, an old friend of Jim's who knew his way around a toolbox and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. The day the new planks went down was a satisfying one. Standing there with Duke at my side, watching the workers secure the final boards, I felt like I'd reclaimed something that had been taken from me. Not just the bridge, but the principle of it all. "This is what a real community looks like," I said to Duke, patting his head. He wagged his tail, clearly agreeing. Word around town was that Marcy had fled the area shortly after the county announced the investigation. No one knew where she'd gone, but rumors ranged from a wellness retreat to her sister's basement. Jim, ever the optimist, had a theory. She'd probably holed up in some HOA-free neighborhood where she can't boss anyone around. Lisa laughed at that. If such a place exists. The fallout from the HOA's collapse had a silver lining. With Marcy and her clipboard brigade out of the picture, the community started to heal. Neighbors who'd been at odds over fines and petty disputes began working together again. Lisa's irrigation system was fully restored, and Greg's deer fence stayed exactly where it was. Jim, always ready with a grin and a beer, started hosting informal town hall meetings at his place to make sure the HOA didn't try to rise from the ashes. As for me, I went back to my quiet routine, feeding the chickens, fixing fences, and occasionally sipping coffee by the creek. Life felt normal again, though I kept one eye on the horizon, just in case another clipboard-wielding menace decided to test their luck. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the county. It was an official document stating that the HOA's jurisdiction had been permanently reduced to its original boundaries, far, far away from my farm. I framed the letter and hung it in my barn, right next to a picture of the rebuilt bridge. It was a reminder that sometimes standing your ground is all it takes to bring down an empire. And if Marcy, or anyone like her, ever tried to cross that bridge again, well, let's just say Duke and I would be ready. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.